Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Digital Supply Chain Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I have another Tom. Tom, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, Tom Pierce. I'm the founder and president of a small company in the U.S. and Kentucky called Integrated Information Systems. We go by I2S for short. Born out of what I thought was a short-term problem back in the 80s and early 90s of legacy systems, by which we meant mainframes, having difficulty sharing information with this newfangled object called the PC and Windows-based and DOS-based interchanges. And over 30 years, we've just found that the problem has grown and gotten more and more interesting. And so integrating different computer systems and also integrating human intelligence and digital intelligence has actually formed the whole pathway of my career for 30 years. And just fascinating to see where it's headed.
Nice, nice. So you've been in the business a long time, Tom. Fascinating. What have you seen lately that's happening in supply chain that's catching your interest?
I think the most fascinating thing, certainly the hot topic of the day is artificial intelligence. It's not as new as people suspect.
Sure.
People have been talking about deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning and machine learning for literally decades, but it seems to be reaching some sort of a critical mass that is starting to get an awful lot of attention. And the thing that just highlights for me has been true since the beginning of computing, or like the beginning of how the humans and the digital technology relate to each other and how they are related in business processes is getting ever more complex, ever more fascinating, both on the opportunity and the risk side. That intelligent, reasonable, wise integration of information sources and information flow seems to be absolutely crucial to a business being able to make wise decisions. And it just seems to be fraught with traps where people end up placing their confidence in untested processes. And so I think that's where the challenge really comes at us to have a broad grasp of how data flows, information flows, insight flows, decisions flow, how wisdom is built.
Okay. I mean, that's an easy perspective for you, having worked in the business for over 30 years. But for younger whippersnappers, I mean, how do you acquire that kind of wisdom, particularly when so much is digitized now and people haven't come through the same kind of academy of 30 years of work in the industry that you have?
Yeah, the key for me, I think, is a timeless truth that remains true and that actually gets a little bit caught up in also this massive generational shift that's going on. And that is that no matter how savvy you are about modern techniques and modern technology, there are still people available who are very articulate at the very human ways of understanding the same phenomenon, the same flow. I think it's very important to surround yourself with a spectrum of people that are multilingual, certainly bilingual, on understanding the digital aspect of information flow, as well as the very human process. So, senior subject matter experts have a very valuable role to play, but maybe with diminished hours, maybe with diminished decision-making authority, but certainly as a check, as a sanity check. Some of those valuable people in my career have been people that had no interest in a keyboard or a mouse. They didn't want to get their information from a computer. They wanted to walk the floor and get to know the humans and watch the parts move. And when you can merge those two, when you can get the best subject matter experts that just know almost by instinct, by impulse, what's good and what's not, when you can get them engaged in what's coming through the digital process, you can really find an awful lot of value in the conflict. That when you are able to reconcile what the humans you really trust say and believe with what is coming out of the computer models or the computer systems, now you've got a different kind of confidence. I'm a big fan of Malcolm Gladwell's writing, I think it was on his in his book Blake, where he talked about how so many seasoned experts just knew when a painting was fake, or when a couple wasn't going to make it in their marriage, and they can't articulate how they know what they know. But when you are able to plug into the humans that truly know what they're talking about in a way that's not dismissive of technology, but embraces technology, now you're talking about true learning at its greatest steps. Ancient wisdom combined with modern technology is the holy grail of information.
Sure. But people like that are few and far between, I have to think. So, how do you come across them, and how do you bridge that divide between the computer processes and the human or business processes?
I'll start with my own experience, but then I think I can broaden it to other ways that have experienced it. I've got a diverse background, very fortunate in that. I spent 4 years in the Army, and I ended up getting plucked out into an analysis branch, where I ended up in a facilitating role where I, as a young 21-year-old, was responsible for facilitating workshops of all of the senior civil servants and retired military and some active duty military that were in their 40s and 50s. So I was listening to people with 20 and 30 years experience all the time. And I took that with me when I started my business. And so I employ a number of retired or semi-retired people as consultants and advisors. They come in typically once a week for a 4 or 5 hour workshop, where we go over everything that our technical staff has been working on, our analytical folks have been working on, and we test it against 30 years worth of seasoned experience. Broadening that a little bit, don't discard the old books. I still occasionally pull out, an Ollie White textbook on how MRP actually works. One of the people I've been absolutely fascinated by is a fellow resident of Spain, Sam Bria, who has written several books over the decades and has, consulted with thousands of people. So I give a special place in my understanding to the very seasoned veterans wherever I find, whether it's in form or a consulting or just, sit in a coffee shop and listen to the old timers. I know I'm an old timer now, but I can still get information from people that are 10 and 20 years older than me. It's foolish to dismiss the older and wiser strictly in favor of the new shiny object.
Okay, but couldn't we just take all their learnings and feed their learnings into ChatGPT, and then, hey, we've got them digitized and on tap in perpetuity?
Oh, such a fascinating conversation that is. Let's start with the fact that a whole lot of people absolutely do not know how to explain how they know what they know. And so to actually download that and digitize that is quite a challenge. I don't think it's time to get rid of the older concepts of mentorship and apprenticeship to actually learn by watching, learn by doing. I know that there's a lot of parallels in large language models and in machine learning to that concept. We are essentially creating elements in our own image. We are teaching computers how to learn the way we learn, but there's got to be an element of humility in all of that. The more you learn, the more you realize what you don't know, the more you realize that the flaws in your own learning. Well, we are introducing flaws into the artificial stuff just as well, just as much. The element of how to decide which humans you trust is now going to be transferred into how to decide which AI you trust.
Sure.
I don't know how many articles I've read about ChatGPT and others coming up with beautiful sounding legal briefs that cite cases that never existed, or academic papers with beautiful bibliographies that I'm referencing works that have never been written. People have been making stuff up to pass themselves off as intelligence for millennia. Now we've just taught computers how to do the same thing. So the problem hasn't changed, the medium in which we have to deal with it and the speed. And I think it's the biggest thing. The volume and speed of information that's coming out of it, discerning truth from fiction. And it's not that simple. It's a spectrum of of confidence and credibility that absolutely, fills the bloodstream of business with a mixture of highly reliable and highly unreliable information from which chief executives have to try to discern what do I trust and what direction do I go. To me, one of the pivotal events in my career, you go back to the 2008, the rise of quantitative analysis and the people that came up with these incredibly complex mortgage-backed securities with the assurance, the statistical assurance that these cannot fail, and yet they did. The overstated confidence that comes from the impression of intelligence that is driven by speed and amplification is a very dangerous thing if you over trust it. So it's always a matter of, double checking, triple checking, multiple sources, human and digital, to, to gain confidence in the processes, and don't trust blindly, human or digital.
Sure. Sure, sure, sure. Regular listeners to this podcast will be aware that I'm ex-SAP. I was in the SAP
Right.
supply chain organization for a number of years until recently. What would an organization or how would an organization like an SAP who builds supply chain software, how would they incorporate what you were saying about needing to bring humans into the system as well and human knowledge into the supply chain business
Well,
processes?
I know that there's an awful lot at work in the migration, the forced migration, if you will, from R3 ECC user communities to HANA S4. And I do understand that the technology is better suited to communication and collaboration, the greater transparency of data, greater interconnectivity of data. One of the things that SAP communities, I think, with good reason, kept out of scope from what SAP as a company does
Let me
is
just stop you there a sec, Tom, because I didn't mean the question to be SAP specific. I mean, in
okay.
general, companies
Yes.
like SAP who are building these digital twins, essentially, of supply chains, how should they incorporate the requirement that you're saying that is needed to incorporate more humans with their knowledge into the system that SAP are and all the others are digitizing?
Right.
How do you marry those two things?
Excellent question. And so I'll broaden what I was saying about S4 HANA and its reach, because I think everybody is chasing the same phenomenon. That when you intentionally make your data and information accessible, I think there's been a movement among IT professionals that out of the nervousness of hacking and trying to protect data, that there's this temptation to just gather all the data and put it in a vault and make sure nobody ever reads it. That way it's secure. The point of the information was to get people to read it. So finding more and more, embracing emerging technologies to make information accessible to a network of collaborative users. And again, I think that's where the designers of infrastructure, of enterprise software, need to understand their scope. And it's not just to collect the data, it's to collect the data and to make it accessible. But it's not, you almost end up with the old Martin Luther concern about printing Bibles in the common language. Well, you need a high priest to interpret that for you. Well, can you actually put the data in the hands of end users and trust them to download and extract it, interpret and aggregate it? Yeah, you're going to get slightly different results, but that's what all humans do with all input, is we come up with slightly different interpretations. So finding that magic balance point of how much data cleansing, how much data interpretation do you do before you put it in a repository, you make it accessible to the end user community, which is not just the last mile, that's a whole other set of pipelines that goes through it before it actually gets to decision making. And one of the trends that I'm noticing in information flow, certainly it impacts the supply chain. The longer the chain, the more it impacts it. I'm hearing people start talking about data pipelines, old
Mm.
concept, new terminology, the old game of telephone. information flows from one system to another system to another system. However many humans are involved, some of the humans add value, some subtract, some distort, some deceive. So how do you ensure credibility from one node to the next? I think you always have to design a closed system. You always have to have a feed. It's not a one-way pipe. You've got to test data on the other end that comes out the faucet for the cleanliness, the drinkability, the toxicity of the information that's coming out the end. And so I think it's a mistake to just say, to take the DoorDash approach. I've gathered up all the information and I dropped it on your doorstep. What happens to it from there is up to you, not my problem. There's got to be better connectivity between the people that are actually understanding, interpreting, and using the data all the way back to its source so that you create opportunities for feedback so that the entire loop improves with iteration. So that too many technical people tend to kind of live very isolated lives, or thinking sort of exacerbates that,
Mm.
and may absolutely no familiarity whatsoever with the people that ultimately use the technology they create. And I think the more we can do to create both sides, the two-way communication between technos and geniuses and the end users that depend on the accuracy and credibility of that data to make decisions, the more opportunity we have to improve with iteration rather than just solve.
Okay. Okay. I've seen some companies, and what they do is they'll often move people around within organizations so they get, experience in lots of different roles. And that
Mhm.
then adds to their own institutional knowledge. And so that they can then have a better
Well,
idea of what's going on. To your point, they have walked the floor. Is that
yes,
something you'd recommend as a way to kind of help bridge this gap?
absolutely, with caveats. Things have seasons. There's a seasonality to data and to information flow. One of my clients, for example, from the time of an initial contract, it's the defense industry, from the time of the initial contract award to the time of final delivery might be 3 to 5 years. So if you
Okay.
are rotating people through functions every 2 years, then nobody is going to be around in one function for the entire life cycle of a single project. So there are times when a tenure in a particular function might need to last 5 to 7 years. I know people don't stay around that long, but
Mhm.
same phenomenon, people change jobs more often. Maybe they can change jobs within the same organization
Yep.
and hang around long enough to actually see the consequences of decisions made. I know in many companies, that's a much shorter fuse, but depending on your environment, if you haven't had the opportunity, I, I had my seventh grandchild born over the weekend. So
Oh,
I'm moving
congratulations.
slowly into grandpa. Thank you. I've 7 grandchildren, 4 and under. And
Oh,
as you, see them grow and develop, certainly it seems like they're getting older faster than I am, but you get this much broader perspective of hoping to see growth all the way into adulthood, to see your children become parents, become grandparents. The really long view of things takes time. And so I think in general, longer tenure in each role is better. But in the meantime, strong collaboration across functions,
mm,
build those relationships with your peers in other functions and, being very intentional. There's way too much fragmentation in meeting structures and businesses I'm familiar with that, the planners meet over here and the supply chain meet over here and finance meets over here and they say bad things about each other, just the intentional embed somebody from another organization in your meetings to get that perspective, learn from them, and then switch roles down the road. So, yeah, I'm a big believer in cross functional training, education, but also communication, collaboration, learn from each other, learn the other perspective, the impact of your decisions on their lives.
okay. Yeah. This is a fascinating conversation for me, particularly because the episode of this podcast that I published on Monday of this, no, on Friday last, was with Sanjay Sharma from CEO of Rombi. And that was a conversation about how to make supply chains more autonomous. And this conversation is going reverse, reverse.
I, uh, I understand that, but the tone is coming from recent experience of overdoing. I am throughout my career an enormous believer in automation. I absolutely love, scheduling a process that will wake me up if there's a problem and there's never a problem. I am designing software for a couple of small businesses here locally where they don't want humans to intervene unless absolutely necessary. But there's a little bit of an element that my geometry teacher had to drill into my head. I could see the problem and know the answer and write it down, and he wasn't satisfied. Show your work. So
Hmm,
it's a little bit like we're watching your pizza be made or tracking the delivery guy on the GPS. You want to have some visibility of what the automated system is doing. You don't want to blind yourself to how the whole process works. You don't have to jump in and intervene. You don't have to go from one inbox and wait for a human to put to the next inbox. But you certainly want to preserve the capacity to see what's happening, to monitor what's happening, and to intervene as necessary. Minimal exception based processing, not totally sealed black box where,
sure.
sorry, you put your quarter in and something's going to come out. Trust me. I don't work much trust. I'm too old for that. I'm jaded.
Excellent, excellent. So, Tom, we're heading towards the end of the podcast now. Is there any question that I haven't asked that you wish I had, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to think about?
One of the things that's been with me my whole career that I think is just taking on new dimensions, and I still find it difficult to articulate, but you're giving me an opportunity, so I'm going to try. And it has to do with the way that systems are designed to relate to each other positively or negatively. I think there's an awful lot of incentive for software developers in particular to make things as proprietary as possible. There's an incentive to not play well with others. And yet there's an underlying current that we all sense that it's better when systems do play well together and work well together. I'm old enough to remember the phenomenon of Unix, and even the US government decreed all programming from henceforth shall be written in Ada. As a matter of fact, Dean, whom you saw earlier, was the first Ada programmer I ever hired. The constant interplay between standardization and specialization, centralized versus decentralized. I really believe there is an emerging art that we are just in the beginning, the infancy of how to leverage new technologies in a way that allows companies, individuals to develop and enhance their career paths in a way that preserves intellectual property rights, preserves expertise, and yet still exposes well the how do you communicate from this system to that system. One of the things that I've been amused by with the emergence of Chat GPT is now my feeds are absolutely filled with people teaching you how to communicate with Chat GPT. Well, I thought the whole point was that was going to be intuitive. No, somebody has to teach you how to talk to it. And I had a problem with my, not a problem, I had an embarrassing moment with my 4-year-old grandchild yesterday. He was trying to tell me what he wanted, and I couldn't understand what he was trying to say. And it made him very sad. So when I finally figured out what he meant, we were back to happiness. And but I think that, as much as the internet is bringing us together, I absolutely love the fact that you and Spain and me in the US can be having this conversation. But, bridging more languages, more cultures, more technologies, more processes, more even, cultural elements to running a business. I, I think that being multilingual, being bilingual also means that you are opening yourself up to be understood. And I think that is as much digital as it is human. to expose your processes, your methodologies. I mean, big scientific makers back in the day just had pages of methodology and assumptions, and all of that seems to be just hidden. Just tell me the answer. Well,
Yeah.
it don't just tell me the answer. Tell me how you arrived at the answer, and then collaboration can actually work. So I really think that a huge part of automation is also exposure of what are your methodologies. You know, Elon Musk made a huge commitment to open source the algorithms. Not that all of us can read it, but some can read it. So the more open and exposed and transparent we can be about our automated processes, without revealing proprietary logic, of course, I think that's really the pathway to community and global excellence. Where if we give in to our lesser impulses of keeping everything proprietary and everything private, and if you want to know the truth, you got to come ask me because he doesn't know it. One anecdote that was just very deeply personal and very well illustrative. We lost my mother-in-law about 6 months ago, and she
Oh,
had a very
sorry.
rare disease, and she got to where she was seeing multiple specialists. And at one very critical point in her illness, two of her doctors that were seeing her in the same hospital room were not allowed to see each other's medical record because they worked for different companies.
Oh.
And that was very disconcerting for us. So,
Infuriating, I would have said.
infuriating is the right word. There was a piece of that also that became a little more close to home and maybe a little more lighthearted. The one physician that seemed most, you know, from most well disposed towards sharing with us all the information said, "Yes, I'll get you that information. Hang on just a second." And then he turned to his computer and he couldn't figure out how to log into it because they had just changed the software. And so that just drove me nuts. We are doing all of this work to bring all of this very important and sometimes life critical information to your fingertips, and then the roadblocks come in.
Hmm.
So we've just got to get better at making information accessible to the people who really need it.
Lovely. Very good. Very good. Okay. Superb, Tom. If people would like to know more about yourself, Tom, or any of the things we discussed in the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
Our website is i2s.us. My email is tom@i2s.us. You can find me on LinkedIn. That's where I do most of my interactions. Welcome any and all conversations.
Phenomenal. I'll put those links in the show notes so everyone will have access to them. Tom, thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you, sir. It's been a pleasure.